Montana Territory, spring of 1879. The wind rolled low and cold across the high plains, carrying the smell of snowmelt and pine. When Georgia Whitlow buried her husband, the sky above the Bitterroot Range was gray as iron, and the preacher mumbled words over the wooden coffin of a man who never came home on time. Georgia held her daughter's hand tight, her son's tighter. Zadie was 6, quiet and watchful, and Zeke, barely 4, clung to her skirts like he was afraid the ground might open and swallow her too. It had been 2 weeks since the fever took Thomas. He had been strong, hard-headed, and never wore a coat unless the snow was deeper than his knees. Georgia used to love him for that. Now, she just wished he had listened when she begged him to rest. By the time the last shovelful of dirt was packed down, the mourners had already started back toward town. Only one man stayed behind. He stood a little apart, tall, with a saddle-worn hat in his hands, brown hair pulled back at the nape. His coat was dusty from the ride, and his boots were cracked with age. She remembered him, Xander Pierce. He had worked with Thomas years ago during the cattle drives, before he took to ranching full-time. They had not seen him in nearly 3 years. Georgia turned toward him, exhausted, her voice low. "You came all this way for the funeral?" Xander nodded. "I heard in Billings. Rode straight through. You did not have to." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to." Zadie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm cold." Georgia crouched and wrapped her arms around both children. "We are going home." Xander watched them walk, then fell into step beside her. "Let me help you get the wagon hitched." She wanted to say no. She was used to doing everything herself now. But the truth was, she was bone-tired, and the children were half asleep on their feet. By the time they got home, snow had started to fall in soft flakes, melting as they touched the ground. Xander helped carry wood inside, then went back for the last of the feed sacks. Georgia built a fire, fed the children, and tucked them in. When she returned to the main room, he was still there, hands outstretched toward the warmth. "You staying in town?" she asked. "No place to stay. Thought I might ride on come morning." "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "Plenty of hay, and you will find supper in the kitchen if you are hungry." He nodded, respectful. "Thank you." She paused, searching his face. "You were always kind." He gave a small shrug. "Not always." That night, Georgia lay awake listening to the wind through the cracks and the creak of the barn door. The house felt too quiet without Thomas's snoring, too big with just her and the children. She rolled over and closed her eyes. The next morning, Xander had already chopped a stack of wood by the time she came out. He fed the chickens, patched the fence, and worked with a quiet steadiness that made Zadie smile and Zeke follow him like a shadow. "You do not have to stay," Georgia said that evening, watching him wipe sweat from his brow. "I know, but I could help, just until you get your feet under you." She hesitated. "I cannot pay you. Not asking for money." "What are you asking for?" He looked at her, honest and steady. "Nothing." Weeks passed. Snow melted. Grass pushed up through the frozen ground, and the river swelled with runoff. Georgia woke earlier, slept deeper. She saw her children laugh again. Zeke started calling Xander Cowboy, and Zadie braided his horse's mane whenever he let her. One night, after the children were asleep, Georgia sat on the porch steps with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Xander came out, sat beside her. "Zeke told me he wants to be like me when he grows up," he said with the hint of a smile. "He already follows you around enough," she replied, her voice gentle. They sat in silence for a while. "I never thought I would be raising them alone," she said finally. "I know. I cannot give them what they need. You give them everything." She turned her face to him. "You do not understand. Then help me." Her voice wavered. "I cannot give you more children." His brow furrowed. "What?" She looked at her hands. "The birth with Zeke. There were complications. The midwife said I was lucky to survive. I cannot have more." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Georgia, I just want you." She blinked, startled. "You do not mean that." "Yes, I do." Her heart thudded in her chest. "You could leave tomorrow. Find someone younger. Someone who can give you sons. I do not want someone else." Tears welled in her eyes. "You would take all this?" "Me. The children. The hard winters. The past." He reached out, brushing the hair from her face. "I would take every bit of it, if it meant having you." Georgia leaned into his touch. She had not been held like that in years, soft, patient, without needing anything in return. She rested her forehead against his. I do not know how to start again. We already have. That night, she let him hold her for the first time. Not as a widow, not as a broken woman, but as someone he had chosen. By spring's full bloom, neighbors whispered. But she did not care. Her children laughed more. Zadie braided wildflowers into George's hair. Zeke rode on Xander's shoulders, giggling until he hiccuped. The house was filled with warmth, not from the fire, but from the slow, quiet love that settled into its bones. And Georgia, who had once buried her heart with her husband, found it again held steady in the hands of a cowboy who just wanted her. In late April, the days lengthened, and with them came the long, back-bending work of preparing the pasture. The grass had begun to green in earnest, and the fence line along the east stretch sagged in 2 places. Xander worked the rails silent and steady, his shirt damp at the collar, while Georgia kept to the garden rows, pulling last year's root rot from the soil. Her hands were rougher now. She welcomed it. That afternoon, she noticed the chickens had stopped laying. She checked the nesting boxes twice, then followed a trail of scattered straw behind the shed. Near the base of a woodpile, she found a fox den, half dug and freshly marked. She stood still, breath held, until she heard a soft rustle within. When she stepped back inside the house, Zadie was stitching a torn hem on her Sunday dress. Georgia leaned down and kissed the top of her head. Keep your brother close, she said. I'll be back before supper. She didn't need to say more. Zadie had grown watchful in the last year, her eyes older than they should have been. Outside, Xander looked up from the fence post he was shoring up. There's a fox in the yard, Georgia said. Close. I want to see where it's running. I'll come with you. I need you here. If I'm not back by dusk, take the children to the neighbors. His jaw tightened, but he nodded once. She took the rifle from the barn wall and followed the tree line east, watching for fresh tracks. The fox had moved quietly, but not quietly enough. She followed it past the edge of the property, through a break in the scrub pine, and down toward the ravine where runoff from the mountains gathered thick and cold. She didn't fire. Nothing had been taken yet, but she needed it to know she'd seen it. By the time she returned, dusk had pressed against the windows. She found Xander seated near the hearth, Zeke half asleep against his chest, Zadie curled beside them with a book on her lap. The room smelled faintly of beans and onion. Her shoulders sagged. I didn't have to shoot, she said. Xander looked up. Good. She hung the rifle and crossed the room. You fed them? They were hungry. Zadie's voice came quiet. He told us a story about the time he saw a bull jump a fence. Georgia raised an eyebrow. Did he now? Wasn't a tall fence, Xander said. But I was on the wrong side of it. Later, after the children were asleep and the wind shifted west, Xander stepped out to check the barn. Georgia followed, wrapping her shawl tighter, her boots crunching over dry grass. He was standing just inside the door, lantern raised. Something's troubling you, he said. She leaned against the stall, watching the mule flick its ears. Zeke's nightmares are easing, she said. But he still asks if I'm leaving when I walk out of sight. Xander set the lantern on the hook and turned toward her. He'll unlearn that in time. I don't know how much time I have left to spare on healing. You've already done more than most would. She met his eyes. I didn't ask for any of this. He stepped forward. Neither did I. But I'm here. She looked down at her hands, then up again. What are you hoping for, Xander? He didn't flinch. To build something steady. With you. Her eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. I'm not the same woman I was. I wouldn't want her. She blinked. Why not? She never looked at me the way you do now. Silence settled between them, not heavy, but full. I've been thinking, she said at last, about the land west of the creek. It's flat, good for oats. But I need help clearing it. I'll work it with you. She reached out, fingers brushing his. I know. They stood there until the lantern burned low, the mule shifting sleepily behind them. There was no need to rush back inside. The house was warm. The children were safe. And between them, something had taken root quiet and enduring, like the earth beneath their feet. Xander found the scythe blade dulled by years of disuse, its edge chipped from careless storage. He set to wetting it behind the barn, where the light fell soft through the cottonwoods, and the wind brought the scent of damp loam and creek water. Georgia watched from the porch, Zeke bouncing a carved wooden horse along the steps near her feet, Zadie humming tunelessly as she stitched a patch into her apron. The oats field would need clearing soon. They had walked it together the day before, measuring with their strides, Georgia naming each rise and dip from memory while Xander listened, his hand grazing the tall grass like he was learning the land through touch. That evening, Georgia folded her mending and stood. I'm heading into town tomorrow. Zadie can mind her brother. Xander leaned the whetstone against the barn wall. What for? Supplies. And the post. She paused. There's something I've been waiting on. He studied her face. You expecting trouble? No. Just word. She didn't say more, and he didn't ask. The next morning, she left just after sunup, a basket tucked beside her on the wagon seat. Zadie stood in the doorway, braid half finished, one hand shielding her eyes. Xander watched the wagon roll down the lane, then turned to the children. Let's get the pen cleaned, he said. Your mother will want to see it tidy. They worked most of the morning, Zeke dragging an old broom handle through the straw, Zadie hauling water from the pump. By midday, clouds had gathered low, heavy with spring rain. Xander brought them inside before the first drops fell. When Georgia returned near dusk, she was soaked to the knees, her shawl pulled tight, the basket covered with a piece of oilcloth. She stepped down from the wagon with a stiffness he hadn't seen before. You're wet through, he said, taking the reins before she could unhitch the team. I'm fine. He looked at the basket, but she didn't offer it. Did the post come? She nodded. It did. Inside, while the children peeled potatoes for supper, Georgia unwrapped the oilcloth and pulled out a folded paper. She held it a moment before handing it to him. He read it twice, slowly. Then looked up. You had land tied up through your cousin? My father left it to both of us. She married and moved east. I asked if she'd be willing to sign it over. His brow creased. Why? Because it borders ours. And I thought if we fenced it, there'd be enough pasture to keep more stock come fall. You've been thinking ahead. I've been thinking about staying. She watched him for a reaction, but he only folded the paper carefully and set it down. Then I'll get timber for the posts. She reached for his hand, fingers brushing his. I didn't do it for the land. He met her eyes. I know. Supper was quiet. The storm passed by nightfall, leaving the windows streaked and the air smelling of wet earth. That night, once the children had curled into sleep under their quilts, Georgia stood by the window, her arms folded against the chill. Xander stepped beside her. You didn't ask what else came in the post, she said. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. She turned toward the table, lifted a smaller envelope, and handed it to him. The seal was already broken. It's from Thomas's sister, she said. She heard I had someone helping on the place. Said she hoped I wasn't rushing into things. Xander set the letter down without reading further. I never wrote her back, Georgia continued, her voice even. She was never fond of me. Said I was too plain, too opinionated. Not the kind to keep a man settled. He stepped closer. She doesn't know you. No, Georgia said. But she knew Thomas. And I think she's afraid I'll forget him. Xander's voice came quiet. You won't. She looked up, her eyes dry but softer than they'd been in weeks. I don't want to. You don't have to. He waited, letting the silence settle like dust between words. Then she nodded, just once. She reached for his hand again, and he took it, pressing her palm to his chest. Georgia didn't speak again that night. She didn't have to. The letter remained on the table, untouched, while the house quieted into the slow rhythm of rain dripping from the eaves, and the fire burned low. Outside, one of the hens clucked in her sleep. Inside, the hearth crackled, and the shape of something lasting took root between them, not new, but deepening, steady as the land beneath their feet. The ridge above the west pasture held snow longer than the rest. It clung in streaks beneath the pine shadows, melting slow into the gullies that fed the creek winding behind the barn. By late May, wildflowers had begun to push through the thawed earth, low purple asters, yellow arnica, and a few brave red paintbrush. Georgia noticed them as she walked the fence line with a coil of wire hooked over her shoulder and a pair of worn gloves in her coat pocket. A few yards ahead, Xander was crouched near a split post, pulling out the last of the broken nails. He didn't look up when she reached him, just handed her the hammer. 3 more, and we'll have this side done, he said. She knelt beside him, bracing the post with one hand and setting the new length of wire with the other. Her elbow brushed his as she worked. He didn't move away. Zadie asked if you were staying through summer, she said. He shifted his weight, pressing the nail firm. What did you tell her? I said you hadn't said otherwise. He glanced at her, brow raised. What would you like me to say? She tapped the nail in, not answering right away. I'd like to know what your plans are. He took the hammer gently from her hand. I've been thinking on that. Go on. I've got a little saved enough for lumber. Was figuring to build a cabin on the south edge, if you'd have me that close. She sat back on her heels, brushing the dirt from her skirt. You'd build something next to the house, but not in it. I didn't figure it was my place to assume. Her voice was quiet. And if it were? He paused, then set the hammer down. Then I want to build something for all of us. Not just a roof. A life. She looked at his hands broad, calloused, steady. Zeke's taken to calling you Pa, when he thinks I'm not listening. I've heard him, Xander said, his voice soft. You haven't corrected him. I didn't know if I had the right. She ran her fingertips along the wire, watching it catch the afternoon light. You're not Thomas. You shouldn't try to be. I'm not trying. I just want to stand where I'm needed. She turned toward him fully. You're needed. That's not in question. He met her gaze, nothing guarded in his face. Then tell me what you need, Georgia. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at the patch of earth between them where the wildflowers hadn't grown. I need to know that you're not waiting for me to become someone easier. That you're not hoping I'll soften into something I'm not. I wouldn't ask you to change. I'm not gentle, she said. Not anymore. I wouldn't want you if you were. She stood then, brushing off her skirts, the wind lifting strands of hair from her braid. He rose beside her. You still want to build that cabin? She asked. If you'll let me. Then build it close. Not because you have to, but because you're staying. He reached for her hand, not quickly, not with urgency, but with deep certainty. She let him take it. Georgia, he said, I didn't come here to fix what was broken. I came because I want what's here. That night, she placed his bedroll not in the barn, but by the hearth. Zadie didn't say anything, only handed him a folded quilt and curled up beside her brother. Georgia watched from the kitchen doorway, the lantern light catching the edge of her face. They trust you. He spread the quilt slow and sure. I won't give them reason not to. The house settled around them. The roof creaked as the warmth of the day gave way to cooler air. Outside, the pasture was quiet, the fence line holding. Inside, where the fire's light danced across the floor, Georgia sat beside him, their shoulders touching. No words passed between them. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already known. The cabin rose slowly, one pine plank at a time, from the south edge of the property where the grass grew thinner and the soil held the scent of moss and ash. Xander worked it mostly alone, though Georgia helped him raise the frame on a dry morning in early June, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her palms wrapped in cloth to keep from blistering. Zadie watched from the porch, her eyes narrowed in quiet study, while Zeke napped under an old quilt spread in the shade of the cottonwoods. They didn't speak much that day, just passed tools back and forth and moved in rhythm. Georgia had never built beside a man before, not like this, not as equals. The silence between them was not strained, but full of understanding. And when the frame finally stood upright in the late afternoon sun, she stepped back and looked at it with the quiet pride of someone who had earned every board. That night, after the children were fed and asleep, Georgia sat at the table, slowly darning a worn pair of her son's socks. Xander came in from the barn with sawdust clinging to his shirt and a small cut above his knuckle. Something catch you? She asked, nodding at his hand. Splinter from the ridge beam. It's out. She set the sock aside and stood. Let me see. He held his hand out without protest. She took it gently, turning it toward the lantern light. The skin was scraped but clean. She dipped a cloth in warm water and pressed it to the edge. You always this careful? She asked. No, only when it matters. She looked up, and his eyes held hers. She didn't let go of his hand. I've been thinking, she said, about the land west of the creek. He didn't interrupt. Once we get through harvest, I want to trade some wool for bee boxes. There's wildflower enough now, and the children could help gather honey come next year. He nodded slowly. You want to stay ahead of the winter. I want to build something that lasts. You already are. She set the cloth down and rested her hand on his forearm, her voice quiet but firm. Then I need to know there's no part of you still planning to leave. There isn't. She searched his face, not for doubt, but for truth, and found it written plain as daylight across the lines near his mouth and the crease of his brow. "I want you in the house," she said, "not just beside it." His voice was steady. "Then I'll come in." She exhaled softly and nodded once. "And I want us to marry." He didn't move, but the shift in him was immediate, like something inside had settled fully into place. "You sure?" he asked. She smiled, not wide, but real. "I've been sure longer than I wanted to admit. When the morning I found Zeke asleep on your chest and didn't feel a single ache in my bones. Just peace." He stepped closer, close enough to take her hand again. "Then I'll speak with the preacher when I ride into town Friday. I'd like it quiet, just the four of us. Maybe a neighbor or two to witness. That's all I want." They stood there in the soft hush of the room, the firelight flickering across the floor and the wind pressing gently against the shutters. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her not as something fragile, but something cherished. The wedding took place the following week under the cottonwoods, with Zadie holding a bouquet of lavender and wild fern, and Zeke tugging at the hem of Xander's coat as they stood before the preacher. Georgia wore the same dress she'd mended through the winter, and Xander had trimmed his beard and tied back his hair with a piece of leather cord. The vows were simple, no grand declarations, just promises spoken low and sure. Afterward, they shared bread and jam with the neighbors who came to bear witness. The children ran barefoot through the grass, and Georgia laughed when Zadie tried to teach Zeke how to curtsy. Xander caught her looking and reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently along the back of it. That night, with the children fast asleep and the last candle burned low, Georgia lay beside him in the same bed where she had once wept alone, and now pressed her cheek to his shoulder. He slid his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "You warm enough?" he asked. "I am." "You happy?" She tilted her face up toward him. "I am." And she was. Not because life had grown easier, it hadn't. The soil still fought back, the roof still leaked after heavy rain, and the hens still scattered the feed in every direction. But there was steadiness now. Partnership. A love not built on rescue, but on the quiet choice to stay, day after day. The cabin remained unfinished. Xander used it for storage and mending tools, and sometimes, when the house grew too loud with the children's games, he'd step out there for a moment of calm. But he always returned. By year's end, George's beehives were built and set beneath the birches. The oats came in strong, and the pantry shelves brimmed with jars of preserves and dried herbs. Zadie learned to read seed catalogs aloud, and Zeke could name every animal track from the barn to the creek. And every evening, as the sun dipped past the ridge and the last of the lights spilled over the pasture, Georgia and Xander would sit on the porch together while the children played nearby. She'd rest her hand in his, and he'd squeeze it gently, always without words. Because this was what they had built, a life stitched from quiet hours, hard-earned trust, and the simple, enduring grace of love that had grown slow and steady, rooted deep in the soil of second chances.